Blood dripping onto dry pine needles sounds a lot like rain if you close your eyes. 9-year-old Cassidy didn't close her eyes. She stood perfectly still, staring at the 250-pound man tangled in the oak canopy above her. He was a massive, leather-clad Hell's Angel, suspended upside down by a single heavy boot wedged in a fractured branch. He was unconscious, bleeding, and smelling heavily of burnt rubber and stale beer. Most kids would scream. Most kids would run for help. Cassidy tilted her head, chewed on a rim of dirt beneath her thumbnail, and quietly calculated just what this monster was worth. Silence in the deep woods is never actually silent. It is a dense, vibrating hum of insect wings, the brittle crackle of dead leaves shifting under the weight of decay, and the slow, rhythmic tick-tick-tick of a violently overheated engine cooling down. Cassidy had heard the crash an hour ago. It wasn't the cinematic explosion they showed on television. It was an ugly, blunt, tearing sound, the sound of heavy machinery losing an argument with a 100-year-old tree. She hadn't rushed toward it. Rushing toward loud noises in her neighborhood usually meant you ended up catching a backhand or having to talk to deputies who smelled like cheap coffee and indifference. So she took her time, letting her worn-out sneakers drag through the underbrush, her pale eyes scanning the tree line until she smelled it. Hot asphalt, ruptured earth, and the sharp, chemical bite of high-octane gasoline. The motorcycle was resting on its side in a trench of freshly gouged dirt. It was a massive machine, chrome and black, now twisted into a shape that made Cassidy think of a crushed beetle. The front forks were bent inward, snapping the wheel completely off its axis. Thick, dark oil was bleeding out of the cracked primary cover, pooling into the soil and catching the afternoon sunlight in iridescent, bruised rainbows. She walked in a slow circle around the wreckage. Her gaze swept over the mangled leather saddlebags, the shattered glass of the headlight, and a heavy steel-toed boot that lay completely detached from its owner, resting near a patch of pulverized ferns. Only then did she look up. He was hanging about 8 feet off the ground. The oak tree's lowest, thickest branches formed a harsh, wooden V, and his left leg was violently wedged right in the crotch of it. The thick, custom-laced leather of his remaining boot had caught, trapping him. Gravity had taken over the rest. He hung dead straight, suspended like a slab of meat in a butcher's cooler. His leather cut hung down over his face, obscuring his features, but Cassidy could clearly see the rocker on his back, the grinning death's head, the bold red and white letters, Hell's Angels. Her uncle owed men like this money. Men like this had once kicked in the front door of her neighbor's trailer, dragged a screaming man onto the porch, and methodically broken both his kneecaps with a steel pipe, while Cassidy watched through a crack in her bedroom blinds. She knew what the patch meant. It meant violence, sudden and absolute. But right now, the violence was entirely suspended. Cassidy stepped closer. The smell of him was overwhelming, a potent mixture of unwashed denim, old sweat, the metallic tang of fresh blood, and a faint undertone of vanilla chewing tobacco. The blood was coming from a gash on his thigh, running the wrong way. It tracked down his leg, soaked into the waistband of his jeans, seeped under his shirt, and dripped from his upside-down shoulders onto the forest floor. Drip, drip. His arms dangled limply toward the dirt, fingertips brushing the tops of the weeds. His hands were massive, knuckles thick with old scar tissue and crude, faded tattoos. He wasn't moving, but he was breathing. The heavy leather of his jacket creaked with every ragged inhalation. She didn't feel sorry for him. Pity was a useless emotion, a luxury she couldn't afford. Instead, she felt a profound, detached curiosity. Cassidy crouched down. Near his dangling hands lay a heavy, bone-handled hunting knife that had evidently slipped from his belt sheath during the crash. She reached out and picked it up. The handle was warm, the weight of it satisfying and real in her small grip. She tested the edge against her thumb. Sharp, very sharp. A sudden wet intake of air above her made her freeze. The man groaned. It was a guttural, wet sound, like a large animal drowning in mud. His massive hands twitched, fingers curling inward as consciousness slowly, painfully returned to him. Cassidy didn't back away. She stayed crouched, the bone-handled knife resting across her knees, waiting for the monster to wake up. Garrison Dutch Miller did not wake up slowly. He slammed into consciousness like a brick thrown through a plate glass window. Pain hit him from everywhere at once. A blinding, white-hot agony in his left knee, a crushing pressure in his skull, and a sickening, disorienting vertigo that made his stomach heave. He tried to open his eyes, but his eyelids felt heavy, swollen shut by the sheer volume of blood pooling in his head. When he finally forced them apart, the world was a blurred, upside-down mess of green and brown. A searing pressure pushed against the backs of his eyeballs. It felt as though his brain were trying to expand through his skull. He gritted his teeth, tasting copper and dirt. He tried to sit up, a reflexive motion to right himself, and a scream tore its way out of his throat. The movement wrenched his trapped ankle, sending a shockwave of pure fire down his leg. "Son of a..." he choked out, his voice thick and distorted by the swelling in his throat. The leather cut had fallen over his face, smothering him. He reached up with heavy, uncoordinated arms and shoved the leather aside. That was when he saw the shoes. They were tiny, scuffed canvas sneakers, gray with dust, the laces frayed and knotted into messy lumps. His gaze slowly tracked up past scraped, bony shins covered in mosquito bites, past a faded denim skirt, up to a skinny chest in a too-large stained t-shirt. Finally, he met her eyes. They were gray, cold, flat, and remarkably unimpressed. "You're purple," Cassidy stated. Her voice was thin and reedy, devoid of any panic or urgency. Dutch blinked, trying to clear the red haze from his vision. "What?" he rasped. Breathing was incredibly difficult. The weight of his own internal organs was pressing down on his diaphragm. "Your face. It's all purple, like a bruised plum." Cassidy shifted her weight, the leaves crunching softly under her sneakers. "My science teacher said if you hang upside down too long, the blood vessels in your eyes pop. Then you die." Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through the fog of Dutch's pain. He was a veteran of brutal bar fights, high-speed chases, and federal prison stints. He was not a man easily frightened, but the utter helplessness of his position, combined with the strange, emotionless child staring at him, sent a spike of primal terror through his chest. "Kid," he choked out, forcing the words through his crushed windpipe. "Listen to me. You gotta go get help. Call someone." Cassidy just looked at him. She looked at his heavy silver rings. She looked at the death's head patch, now inverted. "I don't have a phone," she said simply. "Then run. To the road. Flag down a car. Go to a house." The pressure in his head was becoming unbearable. He could feel his pulse pounding behind his ears like a sledgehammer. Thud, thud, thud. "Road's empty," Cassidy said. "Always is this time of day, and the nearest house is mine. No one's home." Dutch squeezed his eyes shut, fighting a wave of nausea. "Then climb up here," he commanded, his tone shifting out of desperation and into the harsh, barking cadence he used with prospects at the clubhouse. "Climb up and cut the laces on my boot. Get me down." Cassidy didn't move. She tilted her head, her gray eyes locking onto his bloodshot ones. "You're a Hell's Angel." It wasn't a question. Dutch swallowed hard. "Yeah, so what?" "My Uncle Roy says you guys are worse than the devil." "Your Uncle Roy is a smart man," Dutch wheezed, a dark, cynical humor bleeding into his voice despite the agony. "Now, are you going to let me die in this damn tree, or are you going to help me?" "I haven't decided," Cassidy said. The blunt honesty of it stunned him. He was a terrifying man. Men usually crossed the street to avoid making eye contact with him. Yet this half-starved woodland sprite was casually debating whether or not to let him suffer positional asphyxiation. "Look!" Dutch gasped, his vision beginning to narrow, dark spots dancing at the edges. "I'll give you whatever you want. Money. I got cash in my cut. Hundreds. Just get me down." Cassidy glanced at the heavy leather vest. She knew about money. She knew the lack of it meant eating cold soup from a can, and the presence of it meant her mother wouldn't cry for a few days. But money was complicated. People asked questions about money. She looked down at her hands. She was holding his bone-handled knife. She turned it over, admiring the way the light caught the steel. "I'm keeping the knife," she said. Dutch barked out a harsh, wet laugh that ended in a groan. "Keep the damn knife. Just use it to cut me loose." "If I cut you loose, you're going to fall," Cassidy pointed out pragmatically. "You weigh a lot. You're going to hit the ground on your head, and your neck will snap like a dry twig." Dutch opened his eyes again. The kid was right. He was hanging 8 feet in the air. A straight drop onto his skull would kill him instantly. He forced his oxygen-starved brain to work. "There's a secondary branch," he panted, trying to point, his arm trembling violently. "Right next to my trapped leg. I can grab it. Take some of my weight. You climb up? You don't cut the laces all the way. You slice the leather halfway through, so it tears slow." It was a terrible plan. It relied entirely on the physical strength of a man who was rapidly losing consciousness, and the surgical precision of a 9-year-old holding a hunting knife. Cassidy looked at the branch. She looked back at his purple, swollen face. She sighed, a long, tired sound that seemed entirely too old for her small body. "Fine," she said, "but I'm taking the lighter, too." The bark of the oak tree was rough and smelled deeply of damp earth and rot. Cassidy climbed it with the practiced ease of a child who spent more time in the canopy than on the ground. She didn't use the lower branches. She shimmied up the main trunk, her small sneakers finding invisible footholds until she was level with Dutch's trapped leg. Up close, the reality of his predicament was grotesque. The heavy leather boot was wedged so tightly into the wooden V that the bark had splintered around it. The thick rawhide laces were pulled taut as steel cables, bearing the entire weight of the massive biker. Cassidy straddled a neighboring branch, anchoring herself. The smell up here was worse. The heat radiating off the man's body was intense, mixed with the sour stench of fierce sweat. She looked down at him. His eyes were closed again, his chest barely rising. "Hey!" She kicked his trapped calf lightly with her toe. "Wake up! I'm not doing this if you're dead." Dutch's eyes snapped open, bloodshot and frantic. The pressure in his skull was blinding. "I'm awake. Do it!" "Grab the branch!" she ordered, her voice cutting through the thick, humid air with startling authority. Dutch reached blindly, his massive arms swinging. His fingers, thick as sausages and slick with sweat, found the thick limb parallel to his leg. He gripped it. The wood groaned under the sudden tension as he tried to pull himself upward, trying to take the pressure off his ankle. His biceps bulged, tendons standing out sharply against his tattooed skin. The pain was astronomical. Agony radiated from his knee down to his hip, muscles screaming under the unnatural strain. But for a brief second, the unbearable tension on his trapped boot eased just a fraction. "Cut!" he ground out through clenched teeth, spit flying from his lips. "Cut it now." Cassidy gripped the bone-handled knife. It was almost too big for her hand. She leaned forward, balancing precariously, and pressed the blade against the top rawhide lace. She didn't hack at it. She knew better. She pressed and drew the blade across the tight leather in one smooth, practiced motion. The lace popped with a sound like a small firecracker. Instantly, the boot shifted. The sudden jolt tore through Dutch's leg, and he let out a guttural roar, his grip on the branch slipping slightly. His body dropped an inch, jerking violently. "Hold on!" Cassidy snapped, entirely unfazed by his scream. "Don't be a baby." She moved to the second lace. This one was thicker. buried deeper in the knot. She sawed at it, the blade biting into the leather, slicing halfway through just as he had instructed. "Okay," she said, pulling back. "It's half cut. The rest are tight." "You gotta cut the leather of the boot itself," Dutch panted, his voice barely a whisper now. His grip was failing. The blood in his head was roaring so loudly he could barely hear her. "Slice the tongue, ruin the boot. It's the only way my foot slides out." Cassidy frowned. Ruining a perfectly good boot seemed like a sin. But she leaned back in. She jammed the point of the hunting knife into the thick leather tongue of the boot, right where it met the ankle. The blade sank in. She pushed down hard, using 2 hands, ripping the leather open in a jagged tear. "I can't hold it," Dutch gasped. His fingers were slipping. The bark of the branch was shredding the skin from his palms. "I'm almost done," Cassidy yelled, her calm facade finally cracking into a sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline. She ripped the knife downward, slicing through the thick leather bindings, cutting the side of the boot completely open. "Brace yourself," she screamed. Dutch's hands failed. His grip slipped entirely. 250 pounds of dead weight dropped. The partially cut lace snapped instantly. The mangled leather of the boot gave way. His foot ripped violently out of the footwear, leaving the heavy steel-toed boot still securely wedged in the tree. Gravity claimed him with brutal efficiency. He fell the 8 feet in less than a second. Because his foot had caught for a microsecond longer than the rest of his body, he didn't fall straight down on his head. Instead, he twisted in the air, gravity pivoting his massive frame. He hit the forest floor with a horrifying, heavy crack. He didn't land gracefully. He landed squarely on his right shoulder and upper back. The impact was deafening, snapping dry branches underneath him and kicking up a massive cloud of suffocating brown dust. The ground literally shuddered. Cassidy hugged the tree trunk, her eyes wide, breathless. She stared down through the settling dust. Dutch lay completely motionless. His right arm was twisted at an unnatural angle. The purple hue of his face was rapidly draining away, replaced by an ashen, sickly gray. The silence rushed back into the woods, heavy and oppressive. The only sound was the distant metallic tick of the dying motorcycle engine. Cassidy wiped a smear of dirt off her forehead. She carefully sheathed the hunting knife and shoved it deep into the pocket of her denim skirt. She climbed down the tree, moving with deliberate slowness, letting herself drop the last 3 feet into the dirt. She walked over to the massive, broken man. He looked smaller on the ground somehow. Deflated. She crouched near his head. "Hey," she whispered. Nothing. No movement. No breath. She reached out and poked his cheek with a dirty finger. The skin was cold, clammy. Suddenly, a violent spasm racked his chest. Dutch's mouth flew open, and he sucked in a massive, ragged lungful of air, choking on the dust. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound, and spat a glob of blood onto the pine needles. He wasn't dead. Cassidy watched him struggle to breathe, watching the slow, agonizing return of his faculties. She didn't offer a hand to help him sit up. She didn't ask if he was okay. Instead, she casually reached into the front pocket of his leather cut, her small fingers bypassing his bleeding chest, and pulled out the heavy silver Zippo lighter. She flipped it open with a metallic clink, smiled at the flame, snapped it shut, and slipped it into her pocket next to the knife. "A deal's a deal," she muttered to the bleeding biker. But as Dutch finally managed to turn his head, his eyes focusing on her through a haze of agony, Cassidy realized this wasn't the end of the transaction. A low, rumbling sound began to vibrate through the earth beneath her feet. It wasn't the broken motorcycle. It was coming from the highway, the low, throaty, unmistakable roar of an approaching pack of Harleys. Someone was coming for him, and Cassidy was standing over their fallen brother, with his blood on her hands and his stolen knife in her pocket. The vibration started in the soles of Cassidy's sneakers. It was a low, rhythmic thumping that bled through the dirt, vibrating up her skinny legs before she even heard the engines. Then came the sound. It tore through the quiet canopy of the woods, a violent, guttural roar of unbaffled exhaust pipes. 4 heavy V-twin engines running hot and fast. Cassidy didn't run. Running was what Prey did. Prey panicked, broke cover, and drew attention. She had learned that harsh lesson watching the feral dogs hunt stray cats behind the trailer park. Instead, she took 3 slow, deliberate steps backward. The ferns parted and swallowed her shins. The shadows of the great oak stretched over her, muting the faded blue of her denim skirt. She slipped her hand into her pocket. Her small fingers wrapped around the heavy bone handle of Dutch's hunting knife. It was warm. It felt real. It wasn't a defense against 4 grown men, but it was an anchor. The bikers breached the tree line like a localized hurricane. Chrome flashed blindingly through the gaps in the leaves. Black leather, heavy boots, and the smell of raw gasoline immediately overpowered the scent of damp earth and pine. They killed the engines almost simultaneously. The sudden silence that followed was heavy, ringing in Cassidy's ears. 4 men dismounted. They moved with a predatory, aggressive grace that completely contradicted their massive sizes. "Christ!" one of them rasped. He was a mountain of a man with a graying beard and a deep, jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow. His leather cut bore the president patch. He saw the mangled motorcycle first, the crushed chrome, the pooling oil. Then his eyes tracked the gouged earth and landed on Dutch. Dutch was lying exactly where he had fallen. The gray pallor of his skin looked like wet concrete. His right arm was tucked under him at an angle that made Cassidy's stomach perform a slow, uncomfortable roll. He was breathing, but it sounded like wet sandpaper rubbing against glass. Dutch! A younger biker, tall and stringy with nervously darting eyes, broke into a run. He dropped to his knees beside the fallen giant, his hands hovering uselessly over the ruined shoulder. "Hey, brother, stay with me. Grady, he's messed up bad." The scarred president, Grady, walked over slowly. The heavy tread of his boots crushed dry twigs into powder. He didn't look panicked. He looked furious. He crouched beside Dutch, his dark eyes scanning the unnatural angle of the arm, the blood slowly seeping into the dirt from the chest contusions. Then Grady looked up. He didn't look at the tree right away. He looked straight into the underbrush. He looked directly at the spot where the shadows were just a little too thick. Cassidy held her breath. Her thumb traced the brass rivets on the knife handle. "Come out of the weeds," Grady said. His voice was low, devoid of any theatrical shouting. It was a voice used to being obeyed instantly. Cassidy didn't move. She weighed her options. She could bolt. The woods were her territory. She knew the deer trails, the dry creek beds, the bramble patches that would shred a grown man's face but let a small child slide through. But if she ran, they would come to the trailer park. They always did. She let out a slow breath, stepping forward out of the ferns. The dappled sunlight hit her pale, dirty face. The younger biker recoiled, his hand dropping instinctively toward his belt. "What the hell? Where did she come from?" Grady didn't flinch. He stood up slowly, towering over her. He smelled overwhelmingly of stale cigarette smoke, sweat, and cheap peppermint gum. He looked at her small, scuffed sneakers, the dirt on her knees, and the completely blank, unreadable expression on her face. "You see what happened here, little girl?" Grady asked. "He hit the tree," Cassidy said. Her voice was flat, carrying no tremor. "I can see that," Grady murmured, taking a step closer. The heavy leather of his jacket creaked. "Did you see who ran him off the road?" "Nobody ran him off," Cassidy replied, her eyes locked on his chin because making eye contact with angry men usually ended poorly. "He came around the bend too fast. His back tire slid on the loose gravel. The bike fishtailed. He hit the ditch, the bike flipped, and he launched into the oak." Grady's eyes narrowed. It was a perfectly analytical breakdown of a chaotic wreck, delivered by a child who looked like she hadn't eaten a hot meal in 3 days. The younger biker stood up, agitated. "She's lying. Dutch doesn't dump his bike on a little gravel. Someone pushed him. Where's your phone, kid? Who did you call? I don't have a phone, she said. Check her pockets, he snarled, stepping toward her. Cassidy's grip on the knife in her pocket tightened until her knuckles ached. If he reached for her, she was going to cut him. It was a purely reflexive, terrified thought, completely devoid of logic. She was a cornered animal. Before the man could close the distance, a wet, agonizing groan stopped him dead. Dutch shifted in the dirt. Blood bubbled at the corner of his mouth. His good eye peeled open, glassy and unfocused, but tracking the movement. Back. Off! Dutch choked out. The words were barely a whisper, forcing their way past a crushed windpipe. Grady knelt back down. Easy, brother. Don't move. We're going to get you out. Leave her. Alone. Dutch rasped, coughing weakly. She got me down. Grady frowned. He finally looked up at the massive oak. His eyes widened slightly as he took in the snapped branches, the splintered bark, and the heavy steel-toed boot still violently wedged in the high V of the trunk, the leather sliced completely open. He looked back at Cassidy. The skepticism in his eyes was slowly replaced by a dark, assessing calculation. The kid hadn't just watched a crash. She had climbed an oak tree and cut a 250-pound man loose. You cut him down? Grady asked softly. Cassidy shrugged. He was turning purple. He was going to pop his blood vessels. The reality of the situation settled over the clearing like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The initial adrenaline spike of the crash and the confrontation was burning off, leaving behind a cold, mechanical necessity. Dutch was dying. If not from internal bleeding, then from shock. Another biker, a stocky man with a bald head named Wyatt, knelt by the crushed motorcycle. He wasn't checking the engine. He was prying open the mangled leather saddlebag. He reached inside and pulled out a heavy duct-taped brick the size of a shoebox. He looked at Grady and nodded once. Cassidy noticed the exchange. She noticed the way Wyatt immediately stuffed the brick into his own jacket. Drugs. Or money. Uncle Roy used to have bricks like that in the crawl space, right before the men with the steel pipes showed up. She knew exactly what it meant. It meant no ambulances. It meant no cops. We can't put him on a bike, the young biker said, his voice tight with panic. His shoulder is shattered. If we try to strap him to a sissy bar, the pain will kill him. We need a cage. There's no cars out here, Wyatt snapped, walking over. We're 4 miles from the highway. We call a van. It takes an hour. He doesn't have an hour, Grady said. He pressed 2 thick fingers against Dutch's neck, checking the pulse. His heart is racing. Blood pressure is dropping. He's bleeding inside. The 3 men stood over their fallen brother, the weight of their lifestyle pressing down on them. They were outlaws. The system that protected normal people was a cage to them. They couldn't dial 911. They had to handle it themselves, and right now, they lacked the tools. Cassidy stood perfectly still. She watched the panic bleeding into their rigid postures. She watched Dutch's chest rise and fall in shallow, rapid jerks. My uncle has a truck, she said. The words dropped into the heavy silence like stones in a pond. All 3 men turned to look at her. What kind of truck? Grady asked. Ford F-250, long bed. The tailgate is rusted shut, but the bed is empty, mostly. Cassidy chewed on the inside of her cheek. It runs. Grady stepped toward her. The intimidating presence was still there, but now there was a desperate edge to it. Where is it? About a mile through the woods. Trailer park off County Road 9. Where's your uncle? The young biker asked, his hand resting on his belt again. Asleep, Cassidy said flatly. He drank a handle of Jim Beam last night. He won't wake up until tomorrow morning. Grady studied her face. He was looking for the lie. He was looking for the trap. But he only saw a tired, dirty 9-year-old girl who seemed entirely too comfortable standing in a puddle of blood and motor oil. You take Wyatt, Grady ordered, looking back at the bald biker. Show him the truck. He hotwires it, drives it back here. Cassidy shook her head. No hot wiring. The steering column is busted. If you don't use the key and push the ignition barrel up at the exact same time, it locks the whole engine down. You'll flood it. It was a lie. The truck started just fine, but she wasn't about to give away her only piece of leverage for free. Grady exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his scarred eyebrow. So go get the keys. Okay, Cassidy said. She didn't move. The silence stretched for 3 agonizing seconds. Kid, I don't have time for games, Grady growled, taking a heavy step toward her. Get the keys. Now. I'll get them, Cassidy said, her voice remaining impossibly steady, though her heart was slamming against her ribs. But you have to do something for me first. The younger biker let out a harsh bark of disbelief. Are you kidding me? This little brat is extorting us? Shut up, Grady snapped. He looked back at Cassidy. The deep lines around his eyes tightened. He recognized a transaction when he saw one. This wasn't a scared child anymore. This was business. What do you want? Cash? You want $20? No, Cassidy said. My uncle's name is Roy Miller. He lives in trailer number 4. Grady's expression shifted. The name registered. The bikers ran the collections in this county. They knew exactly who Roy Miller was. Roy the Rat, Wyatt muttered, spitting a dark stream of tobacco juice onto the dirt. He owes the club $3,000. He's a dead man walking. Cassidy nodded slowly. I know. He owes you money. The men came last month and broke the neighbor's legs by mistake. They said they're coming back for Roy this week. She looked down at Dutch, who was currently unconscious again, his face pale and slick with sweat. Then she looked back up at Grady. I'll get you the keys. I'll show you the back road so the cops don't see you. But you forgive the debt. Grady stared at her. The sheer audacity of it hung in the humid air. A 90-pound girl in a filthy dress standing over a dying enforcer, demanding a $3,000 pardon from the regional president of a motorcycle cartel. And if I just take the keys from your uncle's dead hands, Grady asked softly, then you have to wake him up. You have to fight him. He keeps a sawed-off shotgun under his mattress, Cassidy replied instantly, the lie rolling off her tongue with practiced ease. It will be loud. People will call the cops. The man with the brick in his pocket won't like that. Wyatt shifted uncomfortably, his hand instinctively patting his jacket where the taped package was hidden. Grady looked at the girl. He looked at the dying man in the dirt. He looked at the mangled motorcycle. He did the math. $3,000 was a lot of money, but Dutch was a brother, and the brick in Wyatt's pocket was worth 10 times that. If the cops showed up, they all went to federal prison. He let out a short, breathy laugh that held absolutely no humor. It was the sound of a man recognizing he had been outplayed by a child. Fine, Grady said, his voice like grinding stones. Roy's debt is cleared. The ledger's clean. Now run, kid. Run, and get those damn keys. Cassidy didn't smile. She just nodded, turned her back on the men, and sprinted into the shadows of the woods, the heavy bone-handled knife thumping rhythmically against her thigh. The woods did not care about the urgency in Cassidy's chest. Brambles snagged the thin fabric of her skirt, tearing at her bare calves, while hidden roots tried to snap her ankles with every frantic footstep. She didn't slow down. She knew the layout of this forest better than the geometry of her own bedroom. She ducked under a rotted birch, vaulted a dry creek bed, and kept her breathing measured through her nose. Panic wasted oxygen. It took her exactly 9 minutes to break through the tree line. The transition from the cool, shaded canopy to the brutal afternoon sun of the trailer park was jarring. Whispering Pines didn't have a single pine tree left on the property. It was a barren, baked expanse of cracked asphalt, faded aluminum siding, and dirt yards filled with the skeletal remains of appliances. The air here was heavy, thick with the smell of boiling roof tar, feral cat urine, and the sweet, decaying stench of garbage baking in the industrial dumpster at the edge of the lot. Cassidy didn't walk down the main paved strip. She moved like a ghost behind the rows of trailers, slipping through the narrow gaps where the weeds grew waist-high against the skirting. A dog barked 2 lots over, a hollow, rhythmic sound. She ignored it. Trailer number 4 was at the dead end of the gravel turnaround. The faded blue paint was peeling off in long, curled strips like dead skin. The front yard was a monument to failure, a rusted washing machine, 3 bald tires, and the Ford F250. It was a hulking, ugly thing, sitting heavy on its suspension. The body was a patchwork of primer gray and Bondo, the rear bumper sagging under the weight of a decade of neglect. Cassidy crept up the cinderblock steps to the front door. The screen was torn in a jagged diagonal slash, held together by a few strips of failing duct tape. She slipped her hand through the tier, found the internal latch, and popped it. She stepped inside. The heat hit her like a physical blow. It was easily 95 degrees in the living room. The air was stagnant, tasting sour with the smell of stale bourbon, unwashed laundry, and the faint coppery tang of old blood from a fight Roy had gotten into 3 nights ago. A single box fan sat in the window, rattling violently against its plastic casing, merely pushing the hot foul air in a slow circle. Her uncle, Roy Miller, was passed out face down on the crushed velvet sofa. He was a small, wiry man, heavily tattooed with crude stick-and-poke ink, wearing nothing but a pair of stained undershorts. One thin arm dangled toward the sticky linoleum floor. A half-empty handle of cheap whiskey sat on the coffee table next to an overflowing ashtray. He was snoring heavily, a wet, rattling sound that caught in his throat every few seconds, signaling the terrifying pause of sleep apnea. Cassidy stood perfectly still, watching his back rise and fall. She didn't love him. Love was a television concept, a word people used right before they hit you or left you. Roy was a burden. He was mean when he was drunk, and he was pathetic when he was sober. But he was also the only barrier between Cassidy and the state. If the bikers killed Roy, or if he finally drank himself to death, the police would come. Then the social workers would come with their clipboards and their fake, sad smiles. They would put her in a group home or foster care, and she knew exactly what happened to girls like her in the system. The system was a meat grinder. Roy, for all his violent flaws, was a predictable monster. She had learned how to navigate him. She wasn't saving him. She was saving her own roof. Cassidy tore her eyes away from the sleeping man and scanned the wreckage of the kitchen counter. Piles of unopened mail, a crusty bowl of cereal, a rusted pair of pliers. There, peeking out from under a greasy paper plate, were the keys, attached to a faded neon green lanyard. She moved silently across the linoleum. The floor was tacky under her sneakers, pulling at the rubber soles with a faint shock sound. She held her breath, reached out, and slid the keys off the counter. The metal jingled softly. Roy grunted, his breathing hitching. He shifted his weight, the springs of the old sofa screaming in protest. Cassidy froze, her fingers curling tightly around the jagged edges of the keys, silencing them. She slipped her other hand into her skirt pocket, her thumb instinctively finding the smooth bone handle of the biker's stolen knife. She waited. 5 seconds, 10 seconds. Roy let out a long, wheezing exhale and settled back into a deep, alcohol-induced coma. Cassidy let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She backed out of the kitchen, never taking her eyes off him. She slipped through the screen door, easing it shut so it wouldn't slam, and scrambled down the cinderblock steps. She didn't run around to the front of the truck. She knew Wyatt, the bald biker, was likely waiting at the edge of the tree line just behind the trailer. She moved through the tall weeds, slipping past the rusted washing machine, and slipped back into the shadows of the woods. Wyatt was there. He was pacing, his heavy boots crushing the undergrowth, his thick arms crossed over his leather cut. The brick of whatever illegal cargo he carried was creating a visible rectangular bulge in his jacket. He looked up, his face tight with impatience, as Cassidy emerged from the brush. She held up the neon green lanyard. Wyatt let out a sharp exhale, stepping forward to snatch them. "Took you long enough." Cassidy snatched her hand back, stepping out of his reach. Her gray eyes were flat and hard. The steering column is tricky, she lied, her voice completely steady. If you try to jam it, you'll snap the key. I drive it. Wyatt stopped. He stared at her, a muscle jumping in his jaw. You're 9 years old. I steer it from my uncle's lap when he's too drunk to see the road, she countered smoothly. I know how the engine sounds. I know where the deep ruts are on the fire road. If you drive it, you're going to bottom out the suspension on a stump and tear the oil pan clean off. Then your friend dies in the dirt. Wyatt looked at the truck through the trees, then down at the scrawny, defiant child. The sheer absurdity of the situation seemed to hit him, but they were entirely out of time. Fine, he spat. Get in. The F250's engine turned over with a high-pitched mechanical screech, a dying alternator belt begging for grease. Then the heavy V8 caught, rumbling to life with a deep, uneven idle that shook the entire chassis. The smell of unburned fuel flooded the cab. Cassidy sat in the middle of the bench seat. The upholstery was torn to shreds, exposing yellow foam that smelled like old dog and cigarette ash. Wyatt sat behind the wheel, his massive frame taking up entirely too much space in the cramped cab. He put the truck in drive, the transmission clunking violently, and hit the gas. They didn't take the road. Cassidy pointed him down a narrow, overgrown logging trail that cut directly behind the trailer park and angled back toward the crash site. Hard left, she commanded, grabbing the cracked dashboard as the truck bounced violently over a hidden rut. Keep the tires on the high ridges. The center is mud. Wyatt grunted, wrenching the steering wheel hand over hand. The heavy brush scraped against the sides of the truck with a terrible high-pitched screeching, like nails dragging down a chalkboard. He drove with a reckless urgency, entirely unconcerned with scratching the paint. They breached the clearing less than 4 minutes later. Grady and the younger biker, Coop, were kneeling in the dirt beside Dutch. The massive biker had deteriorated rapidly. His skin was no longer ashen. It was a sickly, translucent white, slick with cold sweat. His chest was rising in shallow, frantic staccatos. The pool of blood beneath his shoulder had widened, soaking into the dry earth. Wyatt slammed the truck into park, leaving it running, and threw his door open. "Drop the tailgate," Grady barked, not looking up. He was pressing a wad of dark, oily shop rags against a wound on Dutch's ribs, trying to stem the internal hemorrhaging. Cassidy slid out of the cab. She didn't hesitate. She ran to the back of the truck. The tailgate was heavily rusted, the latches seized with years of grime. She slammed the heel of her hand against the right latch, jarring it loose, then threw her body weight against the left. The heavy metal gate crashed down on its chains with a deafening metallic clang. "All right," Grady said, his voice dropping an octave, slipping into a cold, commanding register. "Coop, you take the legs. Wyatt, you take the belt and the good shoulder. I'm taking the head and the bad side. We move on 3. We lift. We pivot. We slide him in. Do not bend his spine." The 3 men moved into position. The sheer size of them made the task look impossible. Dutch was dead weight, 250 pounds of dense muscle and bone, now entirely limp and broken. Cassidy stood by the back tire out of the way, watching with a clinical detachment. "1," Grady grunted, his massive hands digging under Dutch's leather cut, securing a grip on the fabric of his shirt. 2. Wyatt dug his boots into the dirt, bracing his back. 3. Lift. They hoisted him. The movement was brutal and lacking any grace. The sheer physical effort required to lift a grown man off the ground was immense. Veins popped in Wyatt's neck. Coop let out a strained, high-pitched grunt. As they lifted, Dutch's broken shoulder shifted. The sound was distinct and horrifying. A wet, heavy crunch of shattered bone grinding against bone. Dutch didn't scream. He didn't have the air for it. Instead, his eyes flew wide open, rolling back in his head, and he let out a choked, wet gurgle as a fresh surge of blood spilled from his lips, splattering across Grady's forearm. "Keep moving! Pivot!" Grady roared, his boots slipping slightly in the bloody dirt. They swung him toward the truck bed. The heavy steel-toed boot Cassidy hadn't ruined dragged against the rusted bumper. They hoisted him higher, the muscles in their arms trembling violently, and shoved him forward. Dutch slid onto the corrugated metal bed of the truck. The impact jolted his frame, and another agonized groan tore from his throat before he finally, mercifully, lost consciousness entirely. The men collapsed against the sides of the truck, chest heaving, sucking in the humid air. Coop looked like he was going to vomit. He leaned over the side of the bed, spitting a stream of thick saliva into the weeds. "He's bleeding out, Grady," Wyatt panted, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of a dirt-caked hand. "We gotta move." "Cab's too small for 3, Grady noted, looking at the layout. "Coop, you're in the back. Keep pressure on that rib wound. Don't let him roll." "I'm riding in the back, too," Cassidy said. Grady looked down at her. He seemed to have forgotten she was there. He looked at her dirt-streaked face, her small frame, and the utter lack of fear in her posture. "Why?" he asked, his voice rough. "Because Wyatt doesn't know where he's going," Cassidy replied simply. "You hit County Road 9. A cruiser will spot you in 5 minutes. You need to take the logging roads all the way to the state line. There's a junction that dumps out right behind the industrial park in Milton. No cameras, no cops. I can point the way from the bed." Grady stared at her for a long moment. There was a grudging, deeply buried respect forming in his eyes. He didn't trust her. He was a man who trusted no one, let alone a feral child from a trailer park. But he trusted her logic. She was purely transactional. She wanted her uncle's debt cleared, and the only way to ensure that happened was to make sure these men survived the afternoon. "Get in," Grady ordered, turning toward the passenger door of the cab. Cassidy climbed up onto the rear tire and vaulted over the side of the truck bed, avoiding the rusted tailgate entirely. The floor of the bed was hot, baking under the afternoon sun. It smelled intensely of old grease, wet dog hair, and the sharp, coppery stench of Dutch's blood, which was already pooling in the rusted grooves of the metal. Coop climbed in after her, his hands shaking as he knelt beside his unconscious brother and pressed his weight onto the bloody shop rags. Wyatt slammed the truck into gear. The heavy tires spun in the dirt for a fraction of a second, kicking up a cloud of brown dust before catching traction. The F-250 lurched forward, tearing violently back down the narrow logging trail. Cassidy sat with her back against the cab window, her knees pulled up to her chest. She reached into her pocket. Her fingers bypassed the bone-handled knife and found the heavy silver Zippo lighter. She pulled it out, her thumb resting on the cold metal casing. The truck bounced violently, throwing them side to side. Dust billowed up over the tailgate, choking the air, coating everything in a fine, gritty film. Cassidy didn't cough. She just watched the trees blur past, the heavy lighter cold and solid in her palm, feeling the deep rhythmic thumping of the tires chewing up the earth beneath them. Rust flaked off the truck bed, swirling into the miniature vortexes of wind that whipped over the tailgate. Every pothole, every washboard rut in the logging road sent a violent, jarring shockwave straight through the chassis and into Cassidy's bones. The F-250 didn't have shock absorbers anymore. It had memories of them. Coop was failing. The young biker knelt over Dutch, his knees taking the brunt of the heavy impacts against the corrugated steel floor. His hands were pressed flat against the oil-stained rags wadded over Dutch's ribs, but his arms were shaking. He was crying. Not loud, theatrical sobs, but a silent, terrified leaking. The tears cut clean, pale tracks through the thick layer of brown dust coating his cheeks. "I can't stop it," Coop stammered, his voice vibrating with the bouncing of the truck. "It's pumping. Every time his heart beats, it pushes right through the rags." Cassidy dragged herself closer, crawling on her hands and knees to avoid being thrown over the side. The heat radiating off the metal bed was intense, baking through the thin soles of her sneakers. She looked at Coop's hands. They were positioned wrong. He was pressing wide, distributing the weight across the entire rib cage instead of pinpointing the artery. "Move your left hand," Cassidy said, raising her voice to cut through the roar of the rushing wind and the screaming engine. Coop just stared at her, his eyes wide and uncomprehending. What? You're pressing on his bone. The blood is coming from under it. Cassidy didn't wait for him to understand. She jammed her small, bony knee directly into the center of the rag, pinning it against the soft tissue just below the lowest rib. Then she stacked both of her hands on top of her knee and leaned her entire 90 pounds forward, locking her elbows. Dutch's body gave a harsh, involuntary jerk beneath her. A wet, bubbling groan escaped his lips, but the dark, rhythmic seeping around the edges of the rag slowed. Coop fell back against the side of the truck bed, staring at her hands. He wiped his bloody palms on his denim jeans, leaving thick, dark smears. Jesus, kid. You're going to break his ribs. They're already broken, Cassidy replied flatly. Hold his head. It's bouncing on the metal. You're going to give him a concussion. Coop scrambled to obey, wedging his heavy leather boot under Dutch's skull to cushion the brutal vibrations. Through the cracked sliding glass of the rear window, Wyatt slapped the dashboard and pointed frantically. Ahead, the logging trail split into a chaotic, unmarked Y-junction overgrown with briars. Cassidy lifted one hand, pointing sharply to the right. Wyatt wrenched the steering wheel, and the heavy truck careened down the narrower path, the side mirrors violently snapping off dead branches as they forced their way through. Below her, Dutch opened his eyes. They were purely bloodshot now, the whites completely consumed by ruptured capillaries. He blinked against the swirling dust, his gaze wandering aimlessly toward the gray, overcast sky before locking onto the small, dirty face hovering directly above him. He felt the crushing pressure on his side. He felt the jarring impacts of the road tearing at his shattered shoulder. But mostly, he felt a profound, heavy exhaustion. You... Dutch wheezed, the word barely audible over the roaring wind. Cassidy didn't ease up on the pressure. She leaned closer. Don't talk. You're wasting oxygen. Dutch's cracked lips twitched. It wasn't a smile, but the ghost of one. His massive left hand, lying limp on the vibrating steel, twitched. He managed to lift a single thick finger, pointing weakly at the pocket of her denim skirt. The heavy silver Zippo was creating a visible square outline against the faded fabric. You steal my lighter? He rasped, coughing up a fine mist of pink spittle. I didn't steal it, Cassidy said, her gray eyes staring directly into his terrifying, blood-filled ones. I took it, for services rendered. Dutch let out a sound that might have been a laugh, but it ended in a wet, rattling choke. His head rolled to the side, his eyes sliding shut as he slipped back into the merciful dark of unconsciousness. They drove for another grueling 20 minutes. The air grew thicker, shedding the scent of pine and dirt, replacing it with the heavy chemical odor of industrial exhaust and hot asphalt. They were breaching the edge of Milton. Cassidy tapped rapidly on the rear glass. Wyatt glanced in the rearview mirror. She pointed straight ahead, then mimed a sharp left turn. The truck burst out of the tree line, tires tearing across a narrow strip of gravel, and slammed down onto cracked pavement. They were behind a sprawling, dilapidated warehouse complex. The buildings were featureless gray cinder block, windowless, and surrounded by a high chain-link fence topped with razor wire. There were no streetlights, no cameras, no passing cars. Wyatt slammed the brakes. The truck skidded, the anti-lock system completely shot, tires howling against the pavement before jerking to a violent halt in front of a rusted corrugated metal bay door. Before the dust could even settle, the bay door began to rattle upward, grinding on ungreased tracks. Inside the cavernous, dimly lit space sat a pristine, unmarked white panel van. Two men in dark clothes stepped out of the shadows. They didn't look like bikers. They looked sharp, quiet, and carried a sterile, clinical efficiency that sharply contrasted with the chaotic, bloody mess in the truck bed. Grady threw his door open and hit the ground running. Bring the gurney! We're losing him! The transfer was chaotic but fast. The two men from the warehouse rolled out a collapsible medical gurney, dropping it right to the edge of the F-250's rusted tailgate. "On three," Grady commanded, grabbing Dutch by the shoulders while Coop and Wyatt took his legs. Cassidy backed away, pressing herself flat against the cab window. The men hoisted the massive bleeding biker off the truck bed. Blood dripped heavily onto the pavement, a steady, dark patter that sounded like the first heavy drops of a summer storm. They slammed him onto the gurney, the metal legs buckling slightly under his weight, and immediately began strapping him down. "His blood pressure is crashing," one of the quiet men said, already ripping open a plastic IV bag with his teeth. "We need to move, now." They wheeled Dutch toward the white van. Coop climbed into the back with him, his hands still covered in his brother's blood. The doors slammed shut with a heavy, hollow thud. In the sudden echoing silence of the alley behind the warehouse, Grady stood by the tailgate. He pulled a soiled rag from his back pocket and methodically wiped Dutch's blood off his massive hands. He breathed heavily, his chest rising and falling, the adrenaline finally beginning to ebb. He turned around. Cassidy was sitting on the edge of the drop tailgate, her small legs dangling. She was covered in dust, engine grease, and a smear of Dutch's blood that crossed her left cheek like war paint. She watched the president of the local Hells Angels chapter with complete neutrality. Grady walked over. He stopped 2 feet away, looking down at her. He didn't speak immediately. He reached into the inner pocket of his heavy leather cut. Cassidy didn't flinch. Her hand slipped into her skirt pocket, her thumb grazing the bone handle of the hunting knife. It was a useless gesture against a man this size, but the muscle memory of self-preservation was absolute. Grady didn't pull a weapon. He pulled out a small, worn leather notebook and a chewed-up ballpoint pen. He flipped it open. The pages were filled with names, dates, and numbers scrawled in tight, angry handwriting. He found a specific page. Roy Hayes. Whispering Pines Lot 4. $3,200. Grady clicked the pen. He drew a single, heavy black line through the name. Then he tore the page out of the notebook, folded it once, and held it out to her. Cassidy looked at the paper. She didn't reach for it right away. "Take it," Grady said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "You show that to your uncle. You tell him the slate is clean, but you also tell him that if I ever see his face at the Red Dog Saloon again, I'm going to pull his teeth out with pliers. Understand?" Cassidy took the folded paper. The paper felt thin, insignificant compared to the weight of the violence it prevented. She shoved it deep into her pocket, alongside the Zippo and the knife. "I'll tell him," she said. Grady stared at her for a long second. "You're a cold little piece of work, kid." I'm alive," Cassidy corrected him. Grady snorted, a short, humorless exhalation. He looked back at Wyatt, who was still sitting in the driver's seat of the idling truck. "Drive her back to the edge of the woods. Leave the truck there. You walk back here. We'll send someone to pick you up." Wyatt nodded sharply. Cassidy slid off the tailgate. Her sneakers hit the pavement with a soft slap. She walked around to the passenger side, climbed back into the torn, stinking cab, and pulled the heavy doors shut. The ride back was entirely silent. Wyatt didn't push the truck this time. He drove with a grim, methodical focus, navigating the logging roads in reverse. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, fractured shadows through the pine trees. The deep orange light bled into the cab, highlighting the dust motes swirling in the stagnant air. He stopped the truck a half-mile from the trailer park, right where the logging trail met the cracked asphalt of County Road 9. He put it in park and killed the engine. The sudden absence of the V8's roar left a ringing void in Cassidy's ears. Wyatt pulled the keys out of the ignition. The neon green lanyard dangled from his thick fingers. He tossed them onto the torn upholstery between them. He didn't look at her. He just opened his door, stepped out into the dying light, and began the long walk back toward Milton without a single word. Cassidy sat alone in the cab for a minute. She listened to the engine ticking as it cooled. She reached out, grabbed the keys, and slipped out of the truck. The walk through the woods was familiar, easy. The shadows were deep now, the insects beginning their evening chorus. By the time she broke through the weeds behind trailer number 4, the sky was a bruised, dark purple. The box fan was still rattling in the front window. Cassidy crept up the cinder block steps, slipped her hand through the torn screen, and popped the latch. The heat inside was worse now, heavy and suffocating. Roy was exactly where she had left him. He had rolled onto his back, his mouth hanging open, a thin line of drool connecting his cheek to the crushed velvet cushion. He snored, a wet, rattling chainsaw sound. She walked into the kitchen, her sneakers stuck to the linoleum. Track, track. She carefully placed the keys back on the counter, sliding them precisely beneath the greasy paper plate, exactly as she had found them. Then she walked into her tiny bedroom. It was scarcely larger than a closet, holding nothing but a mattress on the floor and a milk crate of torn clothes. Cassidy sat on the edge of the mattress. The silence of the trailer pressed in on her, heavy and familiar. She reached into her pockets and emptied her spoils onto the stained blanket. A folded piece of notebook paper, a heavy bone-handled hunting knife, a silver Zippo lighter. She stared at the items. The paper meant she wouldn't have to pack her clothes into a garbage bag tonight. The knife meant she had steel. But the lighter was a trophy. She picked up the Zippo. It was still cold. Her small thumb rested against the lid. She flicked it open. Clink. She struck the flint wheel. A bright, warm orange flame sprang to life, illuminating her dirty face, her flat gray eyes, and the dark smear of a monster's blood on her cheek. She watched the flame dance for a long moment, breathing in the sharp, chemical smell of butane. Then, with a soft, decisive motion, she snapped it shut. The dark rushed back in, but Cassidy wasn't afraid of it anymore. She had learned how to navigate it. If you felt the tension of Cassidy's incredible survival story and the raw reality of the outlaw world, hit that like button to let the algorithm know. This channel is dedicated to bringing you grounded, gritty, and deeply human stories that keep you on the edge of your seat without relying on cheap cliches. Don't forget to share this video with someone who loves a dark, suspenseful narrative, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next full-length audio drama. Ring the notification bell and leave a comment below. Would you have made the same deal?